Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Configuring Performance Settings lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, you'll learn about how you can go about configuring Windows 7 for peak performance, starting with what kinds of graphic settings you can change to achieve this goal. Next, you'll learn how to configure virtual memory, followed by an understanding of write caching and how it relates to Windows 7 performance. From there, you'll move on to optimizing processes with Task Manager, and then learn how to manage processor scheduling settings to favor certain processes over others. You'll move on to learning how to optimize Windows 7 services, and we'll wrap up the lesson by talking about the MS-config tool, which you can use to help boost system performance. Global Mantex is a high-performance organization, and they demand top-performing computing hardware. Global Mantex management equates poor performing hardware with leaving money on the table in a sale. Not optimizing hardware has a similar result. There's lost money due to inefficiencies. The business need for Global Mantex is to maximize computing resources to maximize the return on investment in the computing hardware that they've made. Although Windows Aero is a visually stunning enhancement to Windows 7, it can require significant system resources, particularly for lower-end or borderline systems. By selectively or completely disabling Aero, you can improve overall system performance, but you have to make a choice between what features you're going to disable and how much performance you want in Windows 7. In this case, Global Mantex has a 2-year-old system that they would like to keep in production because the system is really not that old. However, the system is having trouble keeping up with the user's demand. In this case, you will disable Windows Aero, or look at Windows Aero features and see what could be disabled, so that you can extend the life of that PC investment, save the company money, and lower the total cost of ownership for that particular computing asset. Now, let's move over to a Global Mantex Windows 7 machine and take a look at how to make this change. And here we are. I want to right-click the desktop and choose Personalize. You'll notice that we are running the Aero theme. However, if I wanted to save some system resources without having to do a lot of work, I could change to Windows 7 Basic, which disables a lot of the Aero, well, all of the Aero features, but keeps the Windows 7 visual styling. I'm not going to do that though, because we're going to go to the Start menu, Control Panel, Performance Information and Tools, and on the left-hand side of the window here, I'm going to choose Adjust Visual Effects. Right now, you'll notice that I have Windows set to Adjust for Best Performance. I can also choose Let Windows choose what's best for my computer. Based on a number of factors, including my graphics card and other system capabilities, Windows will choose to selectively enable and disable particular features. Adjusting for Best Appearance will enable every feature that makes the system look nice. This is truly a form over function choice, as it's going to make sure the system is optimized for looks versus performance. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to perform horribly necessarily, but it will make sure that your system looks very nice. The next option is to adjust for best performance, and you'll notice that when I selected that option, all of the little check marks went away. This means that all of the features you see here, all of the visual effects, are not going to be enabled regardless of the theme that I've selected. So there will be no shadows under Windows, there will be no fade or slide for tooltips, and all of the other items that makes Windows look pretty nice. I can also choose to customize my own visual effects theme. So if I want particular items enabled, I can keep those items enabled and disable the rest. I'll choose to adjust for best performance and click Apply so you can see what happens. You'll notice we get a very Windows 2000-ish look here because it takes away all of the Windows 7 theming that we've seen. If you click the Start menu, this still looks like the Start menu but without the visual styling that you've seen in Windows 7 so far. Things don't scroll in as you've gotten used to. So things look quite a bit different, and it's not really quite as visually appealing as it would otherwise be. Now, if you want your users to be using this type of this performance option versus the appearance option, you can still make the system look like Windows 7 and keep most things disabled by choosing Custom and then choose Use Visual Styles on Windows and Buttons. Now what this does is it basically applies a base Windows 7 theme to the system, and you can see then that the user then gets to enjoy some of the features that make Windows 7 a pretty nice sell. You're still going to get some of the menus that come up that you're not going to get if you disable all these features. So this is a way that you can go about making sure that users have exactly what they need, that they understand that they're getting some of Windows 7's appearance benefits, but at the same time, you're not going to enable everything in order to so that it bogs down the system. Perhaps the most precious resources in a computer is the amount of system RAM, or memory. Although the amount of memory that ships with computers is growing all the time, the reason it's growing is because its programs are demanding it. As users load more and more programs and services onto computers and they begin to consume available memory, Windows uses temporary storage called the paging file, which basically augments system RAM. A paging file is nothing more than a file that's at the root directory of each of the hard disks in the system. In fact, I'll show you that. If you look at this drive, you'll notice there's a file called pagefile.sys right at the root directory of the C drive, and it's about 4 gigs in size. It's a hidden file. I did dir/ah to get to it, and it's the file to which information is automatically moved out of RAM as necessary. What this does is it frees up RAM for more compelling needs. Maybe there's a program that said, I need some more RAM, give me more RAM. So Windows decides what it's going to move out to the page file in order to be able to accommodate that new request. Now you may wonder why you just can't continue to expand the size of the page file to beyond the 4 gigs that you just saw, and just use that instead of buying system memory. Well, there's a huge difference between the speed of RAM and the speed of your hard disk. Your memory speed is hugely faster than any hard disk on the market today. So basically what you're looking at is RAM is extremely fast data access and retrieval. A paging file is relatively very slow access and retrieval, orders of magnitude slower access and retrieval than RAM. So when your system starts paging out, which is what people call it when it pages out to that file, you start to have performance issues because the system starts having a harder time keeping up with requests. As I mentioned, running low on memory has a significant impact on system performance as the system begins a process known as paging out the disk. There will come a point at which users will begin to receive virtual memory related error messages on their screen. This is an indication that the system needs either more RAM added or the size of the paging file needs to be increased. Whenever possible, adding RAM is always the preferred option for the reason that I mentioned earlier. RAM is much faster than a disk, so RAM is the preferred option, although it's more expensive than disks, but not nearly as expensive as it used to be. RAM is actually pretty cheap these days. In general, Windows does a pretty good job of managing the size of the paging file. It automatically adjusts it as necessary. However, you can manually adjust the paging file if you need to. In this case, the users at the GlobalMantic's marketing department have begun complaining that the virtual memory errors popping up on their screen are becoming problematic. There are new computers on order for this department, so you don't want to go through the expense and time of adding RAM to these machines. So for now, you'll simply increase the size of the paging file for the machines in the marketing department. To do that, we'll go back over to the GlobalMantic's machine that we've been working on so far. I'm back at the GlobalMantic's desktop, and I'm going to go to the Start menu and right-click Computer. From there, I'll choose the Properties option, and I'll go to the Advanced System Settings area. This will open up the System Properties page, Advanced tab, and the first item you'll see is Performance, and I'll click the Settings button under Performance. You'll notice this is another way to open up that Performance Options window that we saw earlier. On the Performance Options Advanced page, you'll notice that there's a virtual memory option. And right now, we have a paging file set up that's 1 gig in size. We're going to change this to 2 gigs by opening up the virtual memory screen and unchecking Automatically Manage Paging File for all drives. we're going to change the custom size to 2048 megs, which is just basically 2 gigs. And we'll allow it to grow up to 3096. 3072 actually is 3 gigs. And click Set. You'll notice that the Windows provides some recommended information that we're going to ignore here, and that you can also choose to have no paging file, but that's not really recommended. Then we'll click OK. And this requires a system restart in order to be able to take effect. So we'll click OK, and we'll go back out to the Windows desktop. When you get back out far enough, you'll get a note here that says, do you want to restart now or restart later? Now, I'm going to choose restart later because I don't need to restart right now. But understand that the paging file size change won't take effect until the system reboots. Another performance option that you can configure is called write caching in Windows 7. Think of it like this. When a system's hard drive is busy, information that's intended to be written can be saved to a high-speed cache instead. Now what that basically means is this information will be stored sort of in RAM, and then once the hard drive is ready, information will be written to the hard disk. Now what this allows you to do is allow the hard disk to continue what it was doing before, and the user is able to continue doing their work without having to wait for the system to catch up with anything. So once the hard drive is available, this cache information is written. However, the most important thing to understand is this can result in data loss if the system power is interrupted or if the storage device is removed before this cache is cleared. So basically, think of the cache as a temporary holding area for this data. So you've saved that Word document, or you think you've saved it, and it's actually written into the cache and not to the disk. The system's waiting for the disk to free up before that document gets written to its final location on the hard drive. In between the process of you saving the file and the system writing it to the hard drive, the power goes out. Unfortunately, the contents of system memory are lost as soon as the power goes down. So, what you've been left with is a situation where you've lost that document because it did not write it to the disk. Write caching is, for that reason, generally something you want to have when things are battery backed. So if you have a system that has on a UPS or you're using a laptop or something like that, then using write caching makes more sense. Now the other thing you can do is use write caching on USB drives that you connect to the system. So if you have one of those little flash drives that you get at Walmart or someplace, you can enable write caching on that device as well. Global Mantic does use USB connected batteries on all hard drives, on all desktops. So you want to make sure that write caching is enabled for the desktop image that you're working with for Global Mantic. Now to demonstrate this particular issue, I'm going to not use the Global Mantic machine because the virtual machine doesn't have the right settings for the hard drive. Instead, I'm going to show you the properties for the local hard drive on my recording machine, which does have the right settings. So I'm going to open up the Start menu, and I'm going to right-click Computer. From the Computer shortcut menu, I'll choose Properties. On the Properties page, I'm going to go to the Device Manager area, and I'm going to expand the disk drive's nodes, and you're going to see that there's 3 entries, with the third one being the hard drive in this computer. I'll right-click the hard drive and choose Properties, and open up the Policies page on the Properties window. You'll notice that there are a couple of options here. One says Enable Write Caching on the device. This improves system performance by enabling write caching, but a power outage or equipment failure might result in data loss or corruption. If you'd like, you can further improve system performance by choosing Turn Off Windows Write Cache Buffer Flushing to the device. So there's 2 ways you can increase performance. There's one interim step you can take here, and then if you're definitely battery backed, you can choose this option as well. There's a risk level that you take here that's even higher when you choose this option. With this one, there's at least some caching and buffer clearing that takes place. With this one, you don't know how long information may stay in the cache before it's written out to the disk. So it's a little riskier to choose this option than this option. By default, this option is enabled for fixed drives. So if you have a hard drive in your computer, this should be enabled by default. Turn Off Windows Write Cache Buffering is generally disabled by default, but if you have an appropriate battery backup system, you can enable that option as well. Just like their fixed counterparts, removable devices have similar options that are available on that drive's properties page as well for the device manager. In this case, there's a little bit different wording. It's called a removal policy. Now, when you think about the difference between removing a drive, a USB-based drive, such as a flash drive from a computer, and powering down a system, there's very little difference. If you pull a flash drive off a computer, you're basically powering down that drive. So the default for removable devices is what's called a quick removal option, and this is the default. This uses a technique called write-through caching, which means that there could be some caching that takes place, but it's as little as possible, which means the device can be simply removed from the computer with little to no risk for data loss. However, it doesn't perform as well as the next option, which is better performance, where write caching is enabled. Again, when write caching is enabled, even on a USB drive or one of the flash drives, then you have that intermediate area where you can allow the system to keep working and allow the user to keep working, while the system handles holding on to that data in the background until the device becomes available to which it needs to be written. If you opt for the better performance option, you need to use the safely remove hardware icon in the system tray to remove the device, and I'll show you that in just a second. Now, in this case, for GlobalMantix, a user has accidentally somewhere along the line configured a USB device for better performance, and they've been losing information ever since. Now, they don't know that they've configured the USB device for better performance, but I'm telling you that they have. So we're going to go over to a GlobalMantix desktop, and we're going to reconfigure this removable device for quick removal so that this doesn't continue to happen. Now, just like we did before, we're going to go to the Start menu, right-click Computer, and from the shortcut menu, choose Properties. Next, click Device Manager, and then expand the disk drives node and right-click the flash-based device that we see here. Now, depending on the flash drive you get, you'll have a different name. This one happens to be called Generic Flash Disk. So we'll right-click that option and choose Properties. And like we did before, we'll go to the Policies page, but this time, because it's a removable device, it looks a little bit different. And we see that there's a removal policy here, and it's set for better performance. And this is a problem for this particular system and this particular user. So we're going to choose the quick removal, which is the default option, and click OK. Now, the steps the user should take when they remove this device when they have it set for better performance are to go down to the system tray and choose the Safely Remove Hardware and Eject Media option in the system tray. And you'll see that there's a removable disk here that I just clicked. And you click, when you do that, it says it's safe to remove this hardware. The device can now be removed from the computer. In fact, you'll notice that it's been removed from the disk drives option because I've basically ejected it from the USB port. If you've been using Windows for any length of time, you're probably familiar with the Task Manager, which you get to by either pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete on the keyboard or right-clicking the taskbar and choosing Task Manager. Most people use Task Manager to do things like kill errant processes and take a look at what happens to be running on the system, or take a look at the CPU load or memory load that the system happens to be running under. However, there are some things you can do with Task Manager to help system performance. First of all, you can choose what's called Managing Process Affinity. What this does is allows you to actually choose the processor and or processing core on which to run a particular process. In the case of GlobalMantix, they're going to be running a relatively CPU-intensive DVD burning software package. They want to make sure this runs on a specific core that they've noticed doesn't get used very often by their other software. Now, the reason they want to do this is to make sure that the user who happens to be running this software, their system doesn't get bogged down by this DVD software as much as it would if they were running it on the same core as all of their other software. This time I'm going to stay on my local machine because I'm running Movie Maker, as you can see down here in the taskbar. I'm now going to start the Task Manager, and I'm going to change the process affinity for that particular program. So here's DVD Maker. I'll right-click that, and I'm going to choose Set Affinity. And what this allows me to do is decide on which CPUs I want to run this particular piece of software. Now, right now, you'll notice that I have all processors selected, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Well, I'm going to allow it to run on processors 2 and 3, and that's it. And then I click OK. And you don't really see anything change on the screen Except now that process doesn't eat up as much CPU, eat up any CPU necessarily, on the initial two processors in my machine. So those two processors get to stay active on what they were working on before, and DVD Maker gets its own processors to work on that may not be as heavily utilized. And I can see what's being used by clicking the Performance tab, and you'll notice that Processor 4 is not seeing as much utilization as Processors 1 and 2. So it was a good choice. Then I'm going to close Movie Maker, or DVD Maker. Now the other thing you can do is you can change a process's priority. So you can actually provide a process with a modified priority level. In this case, you want to make sure that a particular program either runs better than other programs on the system, or it doesn't take as much in the way of system resources. You may not want a particular product to take away from other system resources. Windows processes generally sometimes run at a higher level than a normal piece of software. After all, you want to make sure that operating system resources are able to be met before application resources so the system stays stable. In the case of Global Mantix, the marketing department wants to make sure that their hefty PowerPoint presentations don't have major contention with other system resources. Therefore, we're going to set the priority for the PowerPoint process to what's called above normal. Before we do that, I want to let you know that you shouldn't set too many processes to either the high or, even more importantly, the real-time level. Real-time is even higher than high, and if you assign too many processes the real-time priority level, the system's going to start coming to a screaming halt because it's not able to service everything as efficiently as it should. So let's take a look at how we set the PowerPoint priority to above normal. Again, I'm going to stay on my local machine, and I'm going to right-click the taskbar and choose Start Task Manager. I'll go to the Processes tab, and I'm going to look for the PowerPoint process that happens to be running, and there it is. I'm going to right-click that process and choose Set Priority, and right now you'll notice it's set to normal. I'm going to change that to above normal, and you're going to get a warning. Now, you have to be careful about changing too many process priorities. And the reason is because it can create system instability, as I mentioned before. So I'll click Change Priority. And now PowerPoint is running at a higher priority level, as you can see when we go back to the shortcut menu. It's running at an above normal priority. So if there's contention for resources, when all things being equal, whatever system has the above normal process, all other things being equal, really most software runs in the normal process, PowerPoint will just get a little boost over other system software. Beyond the two processor items we just looked at, there's an additional item you should consider depending on the role of a particular Windows 7 machine. By default, Windows 7 is configured to favor programs over background services when it comes to scheduling processor time. After all, Windows 7 is a desktop machine that runs things like Microsoft Office. Therefore, when users want to use Office, it's going to be scheduled to a higher level than some other things would be that are not as important, like background services. If you have a Windows 7 machine that's fulfilling a particular role, however, that may not be as user-related, you can actually change this broad processor scheduling mechanism to favor background services. In fact, Global Mantix has just a situation where they need to do this. There's a PC that's going to run backup software most of the time in the background. We're going to set this PC's processor scheduling to favor background services over applications so that background backup software runs a little bit better, more than it would otherwise. Here we are back at the Global Mantix desktop. And I'm going to go to the Start menu, right-click Computer, and choose Properties. I'll then click on Advanced System Settings, and we're on the Advanced tab, and I'm going to click the Settings button under the Performance option. And here I'm going to go to the Advanced tab like we did before to set virtual memory. And you're going to notice that one of the options here is Processor Scheduling, and I'm going to change this to Background Services and click Apply. And that's all there is to it. Now, in the background, Windows has taken steps to make sure that background services now get priority over applications that I may run on this machine. So it's going to help make sure that those application software tools don't necessarily interrupt those background services that are running. So that's a very easy change that you can make sure that systems are running the way you need to. Because again, not every Windows 7 machine is necessarily going to be an end user PC. It may act as a print server, it may act as some other piece of hardware that you want to make sure that those background services stay running in peak condition. Windows 7 ships with a core set of enabled and running services that run in the background all the time. Services handle everything from handling the printing functions on the machine to making sure that the network works the way it's supposed to you name it, there's a service that does it. In fact, if you look at the services control panel, you see that there's a whole lot of running services. And I'll do that on the local machine so you can take a look. So I'll go to the Start menu, Control Panel, Administrative Tools, Services. And you'll notice that there are a whole lot of services running. Background Intelligent Transfer Service, that is used for Windows updates and things like that. You have the DHCP client, which is how your machine gets its IP address. So if this client's not running, or if this service isn't running, then your machine can't get an IP address. You have a DNS client, which does something similar. Basically, if the DNS client isn't running, if you try to go to a website in Internet Explorer, you'll have to do so by using an IP address because you won't be able to use name resolution. For if you have it enabled, there's a fax service. And you're going to just see that there's a whole host of services that happen to run on a Windows 7 machine. Every Windows 7 machine has dozens and dozens of these services that happen to run everywhere. And individual manufacturers happen to put their own services as well. This is a Sony Vaio machine, and you can see that Sony's added a number of their own services to this machine. Now, there are different types of ways that services run. You'll notice that there's only a few services that happen to be started, and the rest are blank, and they're usually manual next to it if they say blank. And there's different startup types for services as well. You have manual, automatic, and disabled. Now, a disabled service can never start, so unless you decide to re-enable that service and set it to manual. In many cases, you can actually disable some of these services that you don't generally need to have running. In a corporate environment, there's lots of services that you don't really need. For example, you're not going to need the home group stuff, so you could disable those services if you wanted to. Now, some people recommend that you don't disable these services, but you just set them to manual so that if a process does need them, it can start the service manually and run the service. It's really up to you how you handle this, but there are some things that you should keep in mind. Not all services are necessary. That's one thing to be very clear on ahead of time. And the other thing to keep in mind is every service that's started uses system resources, including RAM and processing speed. So, a service that's running and not doing anything is unnecessarily using up RAM and processor. A running service can also open up the system with an additional attack vector. Every piece of software that's running on a machine increases that system's attack surface. So by disabling or making manual services that you don't generally need, and in particular disabling the services, then you can actually help protect the system from outside attack as well. If those services happen to communicate on the network for any reason, disabling them if you don't need them is a very good idea. In this case, GlobalMantic has absolutely no need for the Windows Media Player network sharing service. It's going to never be used by employees, and GlobalMantic decided that they're going to disable this service. So I'm going to go back over to the control panel, the services control panel we were just looking at, and we're going to disable that service. And here we are, Windows Media Player Network Sharing Service. You'll notice this service is actually started. So I'm going to right-click the service, and I'm going to go to Properties. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the service because I don't need it, and I don't want it running. In order to prevent it from starting up again, I'm going to go to the startup type, and I'm going to choose Disabled, and click OK. Now, you'll notice that that service is set to Disabled, and nothing will be able to start it until I change its status back to either manual or automatic. There's lots of resources out on the internet to help you determine what services are necessary and which ones aren't. I highly recommend that before you start disabling services, you do lots of research on those services to make sure that it's safe to disable them. If you just start willy-nilly disabling services, you will kill your system, especially with some of the things I talked about before. If you kill the DNS client, your users are not going to be very happy because they're not going to be able to use the internet very easily. The final topic in this lesson is using the msconfig utility to help boost system performance, and it's actually a good troubleshooting tool as well. msconfig has been included in Windows for, well, pretty much ever, and it's a really kind of a good catch-all tool that you can use to start nailing things down and trying to help make your system just run better without having to go to a bunch of different places to do it. Now, if you're going to try to just start disabling software with msconfig, that's probably not the best way to go about it. If you don't want an application anymore, you should just uninstall it. But if an application does something you don't want, you can use msconfig to maybe target that particular aspect of the application. Take something like Yahoo Messenger, for example. When that software gets installed, it also installs a little startup piece, and so does iTunes. It installs the iTunes Helper software, and a number of other little items that start up at boot time that are designed to assist those programs later on. They're not necessary. The iTunes software can run without the iTunes Helper. It just takes longer to load when you decide you want to run the software. However, having to load that iTunes Helper software at boot time does slow down the system from what could be a very fast boot. The more software that you add to the system, the quicker you're going to slow your system down. So it's just like anything else. The more you add to the bag, the longer it's going to take to get it from one place to the other. So you can use the msconfig tool to decide what you're going to load at startup time for the system. In fact, Global Mantis is going to use this tool to verify that only the absolute necessary startup items actually load at boot time. So we're going to go back over to our Global Mantis desktop now, and we're going to take a look at how we can use the msconfig tool to verify that the system is only loading what's really necessary when the system starts up. And here we are at the Global Mantis desktop. I'm going to go to the Start menu, and I'm going to type msconfig in the search box. And you're going to see that it loads a system configuration tool. And if you've used older versions of this, it should look very familiar. On the General tab, there's a Startup Selection option that you can use if you want to. And that's going to help you determine what's going to load on the system when it starts up. A normal startup is going to load all device drivers and services. A diagnostic startup will load only basic services, and this is good for troubleshooting. And a selective startup will allow you to decide what you're going to start at boot up, and this is good for troubleshooting. I'm going to leave that at normal. On the Boot tab, you can actually change the system boot options. If you click Advanced Options, you can decide how many processors you want the system to use when it boots, how much memory it should use as a maximum, and a number of other settings that we're really not going to get into here because they're beyond the scope of what we need to talk about. You can also decide what other information or what other options you want to choose when you boot the system. Do you want to have no GUI come up when you boot? Like during the boot time, do you want to just see text? Do you want to create a log file? Do you want just base video, OS boot information? All kinds of stuff that you can do to make sure that you can properly troubleshoot your system. Now, where it gets into optimization is really when you start hitting the services and startup tabs, although these can also be used for troubleshooting. They really serve a dual purpose. You can use them for troubleshooting to try to determine what application or service could be causing a problem, or you can use this tool to completely disable particular services from starting up at boot time, or particular application software from running at boot time. You'll notice that there's a checkbox next to each service that you see on the screen. If you deselect that checkbox, that service will not start up the next time the system boots. Now, if you would like, you can actually select Hide All Microsoft Services and decide that if you want to just look at third-party services. That by choosing that checkbox, you're sort of making an assumption that you want to run all of the Microsoft services. So I'm going to deselect that so we can see more. And you'll see what the status is for each of the services. And here's one that we just did before, if you remember from just a minute ago. The Startup tab has something similar. You'll notice that down on the system tray for this machine, I've got a VMware icon for VMware Tools. Well, the reason that's there is because it ran on startup. The VMware Tools startup item told it to run, and here it is in the box down at the lower right-hand corner of the screen in the system tray. If I wanted to, if I thought I was having trouble with VMware Tools, I could deselect these checkboxes and reboot the system. The next time the system booted, I would not see the VMware Tools load, and then I would be able to determine if my system was still having the same problem, whatever problem that happened to be, since I deselected the item. So, from both a performance and an optimization perspective, this is pretty good stuff. I'm going to go over to the recording machine I'm using and take a look at msconfig on that, so you can kind of gauge a little bit better beyond the minimal stuff you're seeing here. If I go to the startup item here, you're going to see that there's a whole lot more. So there's a RAID event monitor, which I don't need because I don't have a RAID system in my I don't have more than one hard drive in my system. So I can disable the RAID event monitor. Here's an Adobe Acrobat helper. Remember, all of these items have to load at boot up. So each and every one of them take processing time, and that adds to the boot time of the machine. I don't care if Adobe loads quickly the first time I run it. So I can deselect that Adobe Acrobat tool, and then I don't have to wait for that little piece to load when I start my system. So there's a whole bunch of things I can do here to make my system run just a little bit better than it would normally. And once you click OK, you get a little note saying, you may need to restart your system to apply the changes. Do you want to do that? Well, I don't want to do that right now because I'm in the middle of recording and that would really mess things up. So I'm going to choose Exit Without Restart. We covered quite a bit in this lesson that has to do with configuring Windows 7 performance settings. We learned about how to change graphics settings to enable to optimize graphics performance in Windows 7 and to optimize system performance as a balance of graphics performance. You'll learn how to configure virtual memory or the paging file just in case you can't add more RAM to a machine so that you can make sure that machine stays running. You learned about write caching and why it's important to have a battery on your machine if you're going to use write caching. Then, you learn how to optimize processes with Task Manager, and we moved on to managing processor scheduling settings from a broad perspective. You then learn how to optimize services so that you can disable or stop running services that you don't necessarily need. And we ended the lesson by talking about the use of msconfig to help boost performance and also to use as a general troubleshooting tool for your system. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.